In November of 2024, a helicopter banked low over southeastern Guyana, and the ichthyologist in the passenger seat stopped talking mid-sentence. Below her, stretching to the horizon in every direction, was an unbroken canopy of green. No roads, no clearings, no scars from chainsaws or dredging barges, just river after river, threading through a forest so vast it looked like a single living organism, breathing in the morning heat. Dr. Leslie D'Souza, lead conservation ecologist at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, had spent her career studying freshwater ecosystems across the Amazon basin. She had seen rivers poisoned by mercury, tributaries choked with mining sediment, watersheds stripped bare to gravel, but she had never seen anything like this. In her own words, it was a sea of green that just kept going and going, with waterways weaving through the forest, and not a single visible impact from mining or deforestation. She was looking at the New River watershed, a place no scientist had formally surveyed in nearly 90 years. What her team would find in the water, the mud, and the canopy over the next 30 days would force biologists across 3 continents to revisit their most basic assumptions about what an intact, tropical river system is supposed to look like. This is the story of how a small South American nation quietly preserved the last great undisturbed river corridor on the continent, and how the data that came out of it rewrote every predictive model scientists had. To understand why the findings from the New River matter, you need to understand what has happened to virtually every other major river system in South America over the past century. The continent once held roughly half of the planet's remaining tropical forest. Its river basins, the Amazon, the Orinoco, the Paraná, contained the highest concentration of freshwater biodiversity on Earth. Scientists estimate that more than 6,000 species of freshwater fish once thrived in these drainages alone. That is more freshwater fish species than the entire continent of Africa. The Guyana Shield, the ancient geological craton underlying the northeastern corner of the continent, was the foundation of much of this richness. Its Precambrian bedrock, formed 1.7 billion years ago, supported ecosystems that had evolved in near isolation since the supercontinent Gondwana split apart. Rivers flowing off the shield carried water so clean and nutrient-balanced that they sustained species found nowhere else on the planet. The Essequibo River basin alone harbored more than 300 documented fish species, with at least 58 found in no other river system. But beginning in the mid-20th century, the destruction came fast and from every direction. Industrial agriculture cleared millions of hectares of gallery forest along the riverbanks of Brazil, Venezuela, and Colombia. Hydroelectric dams fragmented migration corridors that fish species had relied on for millions of years. In Brazil alone, dam reservoirs flooded more than 34,000 square kilometers of forest, and gold mining, both legal and illegal, ripped apart riverbeds across the Guyana Shield and poured thousands of tons of mercury into the water. In Guyana, artisanal gold mining operations damaged an estimated 5,840 kilometers of rivers and streams and potentially impacted an additional 28,771 kilometers of downstream habitat, with turbidity and mercury contamination. Across Venezuela, illegal mining syndicates pushed into the Guyana highlands and began contaminating rivers that flowed off formations older than multicellular life itself. The losses cascaded. Fish populations collapsed in river after river, sediment loads increased, aquatic food webs unraveled from the bottom up. By the early 2000s, conservation biologists working across the Amazon basin were operating under a grim professional consensus. There were no truly pristine large-scale river systems left in South America. Every major drainage had been compromised. The baseline, the picture of what a fully functioning tropical river system actually looks like, was gone. And without a baseline, every restoration model was essentially built on guesswork. Scientists were trying to rebuild something they had never actually measured. They were restoring rivers to a condition they could only imagine, because the original had been erased. Then someone looked more carefully at Guyana. The country sits on the northeastern shoulder of South America, smaller than the state of Idaho, with a population of fewer than 800,000 people. 90% of that population lives on a narrow coastal strip along the Atlantic. The interior, roughly 80% of the country, remains covered in dense, largely unbroken tropical forest. In 2009, Guyana's government made a decision that seemed economically irrational at the time. Rather than opening the interior to large-scale resource extraction, It partnered with Norway on a forest protection agreement worth $250 million. The arrangement was straightforward. Norway would pay Guyana to keep its forests standing. When massive offshore oil reserves were discovered beginning in 2015, more than 11 billion barrels of crude, many observers expected the country to abandon its environmental commitments entirely. The oil revenue projections were enormous. $157 billion in earnings by 2040, according to some estimates. Production was expected to exceed 1 million barrels per day by 2025. But the government did not abandon the forest strategy. It doubled down. It launched the Low Carbon Development Strategy 2030, a framework designed to monetize forest preservation through international carbon credit markets while simultaneously developing oil revenues. In 2022, Guyana signed a landmark agreement with Hess Corporation, one of the oil companies drilling offshore, for the purchase of 37.5 million carbon credits worth a minimum of $750 million over 10 years. It was an arrangement unlike anything the world had seen. The same country extracting oil from the seafloor was selling the carbon value of its standing forests to one of the companies doing the drilling. The strategy was ambitious, but it contained a blind spot that nobody had addressed. The forests were protected on paper, the carbon math was sound on spreadsheets, but nobody actually knew what was living inside them. Vast stretches of Guyana's interior had never been scientifically documented. The biodiversity models underpinning the entire conservation framework were extrapolated from data collected in other regions, not from the ground in Guyana. The models were sophisticated estimates, and as it turned out, they were not even close to accurate. Leslie de Souza had been working in Guyana for years, building relationships with indigenous communities and Guyanese scientific institutions, when she proposed what would become the largest and most comprehensive biological expedition ever mounted in the country. The target was the Acarai-Corentyne Corridor, a 1.5 million hectare expanse of wild forests, creeks and mountains in southeastern Guyana. The corridor was bounded by two of the country's largest rivers, the Essequibo to the west and the New River to the east. It stretched 250 kilometers from the peaks of the Acarai Mountains in the south to the lowland forests of central Guyana in the north. No biological inventory had been conducted in the New River watershed since the 1930s. The area had been shielded from logging, mining, and other extractive industries for decades, largely because it was so remote that getting there required either a helicopter or weeks of overland travel through trackless forest. It was, in effect, a natural control group, a vast stretch of tropical river and forest that had been left entirely alone while the rest of the continent was being transformed around it. De Souza assembled a team of 55 experts spanning geology, botany, ichthyology, ornithology, herpetology, mammalogy, soil science, and local ecology. The partnership brought together the Protected Areas Commission of Guyana, the Field Museum, the University of Guyana, Conservation International Guyana, and the Frankfurt Zoological Society. But critically, the team also included indigenous experts from the Waiwai, Wapishana, and Trio communities, people who carried generational knowledge of the land that no outside scientist could replicate. As de Souza herself put it, the Amerindian communities know more about these areas than the foreign scientists who come to study the region's biodiversity. The plan was a rapid biological inventory conducted over 1 month from 3 campsites, 2 along the upper Essequibo River and 1 at the junction of the New and Corentyne rivers. The team deployed every available tool: traditional seining, gill netting, hand nets, cast nets, and drag seines for fish, mist nets for bats, camera traps for mammals running around the clock, audio recording stations for bird calls and bat echolocation, and environmental DNA sampling, a cutting-edge technique that detects species by analyzing genetic material they shed into the water, allowing researchers to identify organisms without ever seeing or handling them. Then something happened that nobody had planned for. During a travel day between campsites, the team documented ancient petroglyphs carved into riverside boulders. Some of the petroglyphs depicted fishing scenes. The indigenous team members recognized the designs and suggested a technique their communities had used for generations: poison vine fishing. The method involves crushing the roots of specific plants and releasing their natural compounds into a contained section of water. The chemicals temporarily stun fish, causing them to surface, where they can be identified, measured, photographed, and released. It was a technique born from thousands of years of ecological knowledge, encoded in stone and oral tradition. And it turned out to be far more effective at capturing certain cryptic, bottom-dwelling species than any of the modern research equipment the biologists had brought with them. De Souza made the call. The team integrated the indigenous methods alongside their scientific protocols. Environmental DNA captured broad species presence across entire stretches of river. Poison vine fishing captured species that eDNA alone would have missed. Camera traps ran through the night. Audio stations recorded the dawn chorus and the calls of species that had never been catalogued in this watershed. For 30 days, through rain, mud, and tropical heat, the team waded into black water creeks, hiked ridgelines above the canopy, and pulled sampling bottles through water so transparent they could see the sandy riverbed 3 meters below the surface. The preliminary results came back in December of 2024, and they did not match any existing model, not even the optimistic ones. The team had documented over 600 species of plants and more than 1,215 species of vertebrates across the corridor. That vertebrate count alone was extraordinary. To put that in perspective, entire countries with decades of survey history have recorded fewer vertebrate species in total. 22 of those species had never before been recorded anywhere in Guyana, and at least 30 were entirely new to science. Organisms that had never been described, named, or catalogued by any researcher on Earth. 33 of the newly recorded species were fish. Some had been collected only through the poison vine technique that indigenous experts had suggested after studying the petroglyphs. De Souza described the significance at the Global Biodiversity Alliance Summit in Georgetown in July of 2025, saying that the team discovered dozens of potential new species of fishes, some of which were only collected using a vine fishing technique suggested by indigenous experts. The idea, she said, emerged after documenting ancient petroglyphs on a travel day and turned out to be far more effective than the typical research gear used by biologists. The fish data alone forced an immediate revision of the national species list. 40 new records were added to Guyana's fish inventory from a single expedition, but the fish were only one chapter of the story. The team recorded the speckled spinetail, a bird never before documented in Guyana. They discovered 2 new amphibian species. They documented crested eagles, a raptor so rare in tropical forests that its presence alone is considered a direct indicator of pristine, undisturbed ecosystem health. Camera traps estimated roughly 400 jaguars living within the corridor, 400 large predators in a single landscape unit, a density that conservation models had not predicted was possible in any remaining South American habitat. The cascade was visible everywhere the team looked. Intact canopy kept the rivers shaded and cool. Cool water supported temperature-sensitive fish species that had vanished from degraded rivers elsewhere on the continent. Healthy fish populations supported giant river otters, black caimans, and arapaima, the largest freshwater fish in the neotropics. Undisturbed riverbanks prevented erosion, keeping sediment loads negligible and water clarity extraordinary. That clarity allowed submerged vegetation to flourish, which provided nursery habitat for juvenile fish, which fed the predators, which maintained the balance. The system was not merely surviving, it was operating at a level of ecological productivity that the models had said no longer existed anywhere on the continent. The scientists expected to find a healthy river. What they found was a river system running at full capacity, undiminished, in a world that had assumed full capacity was a memory. The models were not wrong about the biology, they were wrong about what was possible. When you remove the damage, the recovery is not incremental. It is exponential. The system does not just heal, it compounds. Every species that persists supports 3 more that depend on it. Every intact riverbank prevents the sediment that would have smothered the spawning gravel downstream. Every canopy tree that remains standing keeps the water cool enough for another generation of temperature-sensitive larvae to survive. The data from the new river did not merely fill a gap in the scientific record, it reset the ceiling on what conservation could aspire to. Here is a detail that rarely makes it into the conversation about conservation economics. The cost of keeping the Acarai-Corentyne corridor intact has been, in practical terms, almost nothing. Guyana did not build a fence around it. It did not deploy an army of rangers. It did not construct a filtration plant or an artificial hatchery. The forest and the rivers did the work themselves, filtering water, cycling nutrients, storing carbon, cooling streams, sustaining biodiversity, rebuilding soil, regulating humidity, around the clock, every day, for free. The country simply chose not to destroy it. Compare that to the cost of restoring a single degraded watershed elsewhere, in the United States. Removing one medium-sized dam and rehabilitating the river behind it routinely costs between $10 million and $50 million, with decades of monitoring afterward. Guyana's forests store an estimated 19.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, making them one of the largest carbon sinks on Earth relative to the country's size and population. A river that purifies its own water, regulates its own temperature, and engineers its own biodiversity without a single dollar of operating budget. That is not romantic nature worship. That is hard-nosed economics, measured in services that would cost billions to replicate with infrastructure. But this story is not simple, and pretending otherwise would betray everything the data actually shows. Guyana's interior is not empty. Indigenous communities, the Wawa, the Wapishana, the Trio, and others, have lived in and around these forests for centuries. They are not spectators to conservation. They are the reason many of these ecosystems are intact in the first place. And the deals being made over their forests have not always included their voices. The carbon credit agreement with Hess Corporation, for all its global ambition, provoked a formal complaint from the Amerindian Peoples Association, which alleged that indigenous communities were not adequately consulted before their ancestral forests were placed onto the international carbon market. Vice President Bharat Jagdeo stated that 30% of the Hess revenue would be directed to Amerindian communities, but some community leaders argued the percentage was insufficient and that the consultation process fell short of the legal requirements under Guyana's own Amerindian Act. Meanwhile, gold mining presses inward. It accounts for 70% of the country's gold production and employs more than 15,000 people in the hinterland, many of them from the same indigenous communities the conservation framework is supposed to protect. Mercury from these operations has contaminated rivers in the Rupununi region. A study conducted by the World Wildlife Fund and the South Rupununi District Council found elevated mercury levels in Wapishana communities living along affected riverbanks. For these families, the promise of biodiversity data and carbon credits can feel abstract when the water they bathe there, children in carries poison from the mine upstream. The miners are not villains. They are people earning a living in one of the few industries available to them in the hinterland. And the tension between preserving what the new river revealed and providing real economic alternatives to the people who live closest to these ecosystems is the central unresolved question of Guyana's entire conservation experiment. Picture the new river one more time, not from a helicopter this time, but from the water itself. A biologist kneeling in a dugout canoe, trailing her hand through water so clear she can count the pebbles on the bottom. Around her, the forest canopy arches overhead in an unbroken cathedral of green. A giant otter surfaces 15 meters upstream, watches her with dark, steady eyes, and dives without a sound. Somewhere in the branches above, a crested eagle sits motionless, scanning the river for prey. Beneath the surface, at least 33 species of fish are moving through the current that no scientist has ever given a name. This is what a river looks like when it has been allowed to remain a river. Not managed, not engineered, not restored after being broken. Just left alone, running on bedrock that is 1.7 billion years old, doing what it has done since before anything with a backbone existed on this planet. What the Field Museum team found in the Acarai-Corentyne corridor was not just a catalogue of new species. It was a mirror held up to every degraded watershed on the continent. It showed scientists what their models were missing because every model had been calibrated against damaged systems. When you build your instruments to measure damage, you lose the ability to recognize what undamaged actually looks like. The new river gave that back. And the question it leaves us with is not whether places like this can be protected. We already know how. Guyana proved it. The question is whether we will choose to protect them before the choice is no longer ours to make. I want to know what hit you hardest about this one. Was it the number of new species, the economics of doing nothing, or the fact that a river like this still exists at all? Tell me in the comments. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time. We cover stories about restoration and the people who are fixing what is broken. Hit subscribe. See you in the next one.